Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt like you didn't belong? That uncomfortable feeling when eyes turn toward you, and something in the air just feels off. Well, that's exactly what happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. But here's the thing, what started as a simple lunch would become a story that nobody in that room would ever forget. Let me take you there. The sun was painting everything golden that afternoon at Anderson's Bistro. You know the kind of place I'm talking about, where the silverware gleams, where every napkin is folded just so, and where a simple salad costs more than most people spend on groceries for a week. The restaurant hummed with that quiet energy of success. Businessmen in $1,000 suits discussed million-dollar deals. Young couples celebrated promotions and anniversaries. The soft notes of a piano drifted through the air, mixing with the gentle clinking of wine glasses and the murmur of satisfied conversations. This was Chicago's elite at play. This was where the city's most important people came to see and be seen. And then, the front door opened. In walked Mrs. Margaret Washington. She moved slowly, but with purpose. You know how some elderly people shuffle when they walk? Not Margaret. Despite her 78 years, her back was straight, her head held high. She wore a navy blue coat, not expensive, but carefully maintained. The kind of coat that had been loved and cared for over many years. Her small black handbag was tucked securely under her arm, and there was something about the way she carried herself. Something that whispered of a life well lived, of struggles overcome, of dignity that couldn't be shaken. But as she stood there in the doorway, something shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere. Conversations didn't stop, but they paused. Glances were exchanged. And the hostess at the front desk? Her smile seemed to freeze on her face. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her voice warm and polite. "I have a reservation under Washington." The hostess, a young woman probably in her 20s, looked down at her book. Her fingers traced the list of names, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat too long, she hesitated. "Of course," she said, but her smile felt forced now. "Plastic. Right this way, Mrs. Washington." And where do you think they seated this dignified grandmother? The best table by the window where she could watch the city go by. A cozy booth in the center of the restaurant. No, they walked her past all the prime seating, past the couples holding hands over candlelit tables, past the business deals being made in comfortable booths, all the way to the back corner. Right next to the kitchen door. The worst table in the house. Margaret noticed, of course she did. But she simply smiled, thanked the hostess, and took her seat. She folded her hands on the table, opened the menu, and waited. She had no idea what was about to happen. The waiter who would change everything. His name was Todd. 27 years old, been working at Anderson's for about 2 years. He had that easy confidence that comes from being young and thinking you know how the world works. Todd was assigned to Margaret's section, and as he glanced over at table 12, her table, something crossed his face. Something that made my stomach turn just thinking about it. He saw an elderly black woman, sitting alone, in clothes that weren't designer labels. And in that split second, he made a decision that would cost him everything. He walked right past her table. Margaret looked up expectantly as he approached, ready to place her order. But Todd barely glanced her way. He had other tables to serve, more important customers to attend to. And so she waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Margaret watched as Todd stopped at the table next to hers, a young couple who'd arrived 15 minutes after she did. His whole demeanor changed. Suddenly he was all smiles and charm. "Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Anderson's. Can I start you off with some of our signature cocktails? Our bartender just created this amazing new mojito that's absolutely to die for." The couple laughed. They chatted. They flirted with Todd, and he flirted right back. He took their drink orders, recommended appetizers, treated them like they were the most important people in the world. All while Margaret sat 3 feet away, still waiting for someone to even acknowledge she existed. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been completely ignored? Not just overlooked, but deliberately, purposefully made to feel invisible? That's what was happening to Margaret Washington. She sat there with the grace of someone who'd lived through much worse than a rude waiter. But I could see it in her eyes, not anger, not frustration, just a quiet sadness that said, "I've seen this before." Todd made his rounds to every other table in his section. He refilled water glasses, took orders, cracked jokes. His voice carried across the restaurant as he laughed with customers, his energy infectious and warm. Except when it came to table 12. When he walked past Margaret, his expression went flat. Cold. Like she wasn't even there. The other diners started to notice. A young woman 2 tables over whispered to her boyfriend, "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" An older gentleman kept glancing between Todd and Margaret, his brow furrowed in confusion. The tension was building, like a storm cloud gathering overhead. Margaret remained perfectly composed. She sipped her water, when she could find some in her glass. She studied the menu carefully, even though she'd probably already decided what she wanted. She checked her watch once, maybe twice, but she never complained. Never raised her voice. Never demanded attention. That's not who she was. But someone else was watching. Someone whose blood was beginning to boil with every passing minute. At a table near the bar sat a man in his late 30s. Navy blazer, perfectly pressed. Dark eyes that were taking in every detail of what was happening across the room. His name was Michael Anderson, though Todd had no idea who he was. Michael's fingers drummed quietly on his table as he watched Todd serve everyone except the woman in the corner. His jaw tightened when he saw Todd laugh with other customers while completely ignoring her. His hands clenched when he watched Margaret check her watch again, still waiting patiently for service that should have come 30 minutes ago. Because you see, Michael Anderson wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of Anderson's Bistro. Every detail of this restaurant, from the golden lighting to the carefully curated wine list, bore his personal touch. He'd built this place from nothing, pouring his heart and soul into creating something beautiful. Something that would make his family proud. And the woman sitting alone at table 12, being treated like she didn't matter, that was his mother. Michael had been having lunch at his own restaurant when Margaret arrived. He'd watched the hostess seat her at the worst table. He'd seen Todd's behavior from the very beginning. And with every passing minute, his anger grew. But here's what made this moment so powerful. Michael could have stepped in immediately. He could have marched over there, revealed who he was, and put Todd in his place right from the start. Instead, he chose to watch. He wanted to see how far Todd would go. He wanted to understand exactly who this young man was when he thought nobody important was watching. He wanted there to be no room for excuses, no way for Todd to claim it was just a misunderstanding. So Michael sat there, watching his own mother be treated with disrespect in the restaurant he'd built as a tribute to everything she'd taught him about dignity, hard work, and treating people right. The irony was almost too much to bear. By now, Margaret had been sitting there for half an hour. Half an hour without proper service. Half an hour watching everyone around her receive the attention and respect she was being denied. Her water glass had been empty for 20 minutes. Other tables had received bread, appetizers, full meals. The couple next to her was already on dessert. Finally, Todd approached her table. But not with apology or urgency. With barely concealed irritation. "Sorry about the wait," he said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sorry at all. "We're really swamped today. What can I get you?" Margaret looked up at him with those kind eyes that had seen so much in 78 years of living. Eyes that had watched the world change, that had seen progress and setbacks, hope and disappointment. "I'd like to place my order, please," she said simply. Her voice was steady, polite, completely without accusation. Todd sighed, actually sighed, as if serving her was some great inconvenience. "Yeah, okay. What do you want?" And that's when everything changed. Because across the room, Michael Anderson had heard enough. He stood up from his table, his movement deliberate and controlled. Several diners noticed him walking across the restaurant floor, something in his bearing commanding attention even though they didn't know who he was. Todd was still standing at Margaret's table, pen poised over his order pad with obvious impatience, when a voice behind him said, "Excuse me, Todd." Todd turned around, and the blood drained from his face. Standing there was the owner of Anderson's Bistro. The man who signed his paychecks. The man whose restaurant this was. And Todd suddenly realized he had no idea how long Michael had been watching. "Oh, Mr. Anderson." Todd stammered, his demeanor changing completely. "I didn't know you were here today." Michael's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "I've been here the whole time, Todd. Watching." The restaurant began to quiet around them. The piano music seemed to fade. Other conversations dropped to whispers. "Watching what?" Todd asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. Michael's eyes moved to Margaret, still sitting patiently at her table, and then back to Todd. "Watching you ignore my mother for the past 30 minutes. The silence that followed those words was deafening. The silence in Anderson's Bistro was deafening. Have you ever been in a room when something so shocking happens that everyone just stops? When time seems to freeze and you can actually feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. That's exactly what happened when Michael Anderson said those 6 words that changed everything. Watching you ignore my mother. I wish you could have seen Todd's face in that moment. The color didn't just drain from his cheeks, it disappeared completely. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His hands started to shake as the reality of what he'd done crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Your mother, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Todd's face. Yes, my mother. The woman you've been treating like she's invisible for the past 30 minutes. The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. Even the piano player had stopped mid-note, his fingers frozen over the keys. Every conversation had died. Every fork had stopped moving. Every eye in the place was focused on this moment of truth. Todd's mouth moved, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? What excuse could he offer that would make this right? There wasn't one. I didn't know. Todd started, but Michael cut him off. You didn't know what, Todd? That she deserved the same respect as every other customer. That she had feelings. That she was someone's mother, someone's grandmother. Michael's voice remained calm, but you could hear the controlled anger underneath. This wasn't someone losing their temper. This was someone who was deeply, profoundly disappointed. You didn't know, Michael continued, because you decided not to know. You took one look at her and made a judgment. And then you acted on that judgment. Around the dining room, something beautiful was happening. The other customers weren't looking away in embarrassment or pretending nothing was happening. They were watching. They were witnessing. They were understanding. The young woman who'd whispered to her boyfriend earlier had tears in her eyes. An older businessman was shaking his head, his face filled with disgust at Todd's behavior. A family at a corner table was having a quiet conversation with their teenage children about what they were seeing. This wasn't just about Todd and Margaret anymore. This was about all of them. About the kind of people they wanted to be. About the kind of world they wanted to live in. Margaret herself sat quietly through all of this, her hands still folded on the table, watching her son defend her dignity. But there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at seeing Todd get his comeuppance. There was just sadness. Sadness that this had been necessary at all. Michael turned away from Todd and walked slowly to his mother's table. The entire restaurant watched as he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly, but in the silence of the restaurant, everyone could hear him. I should have stopped this sooner. Margaret reached across the table and patted her son's hand. Her touch was gentle, loving, without a trace of anger or bitterness. No, sweetheart, she said, her voice carrying that warm strength that had guided Michael his entire life. You did exactly the right thing. But you are sitting here being treated badly in my own restaurant. The restaurant I built to honor everything you taught me. Margaret smiled then, that radiant smile that had gotten her family through hard times and good times alike. Michael, baby, listen to me. You didn't just build a restaurant. You built a test. And today, that young man failed it. But you passed it with flying colors. She squeezed his hand. You let him show everyone exactly who he was when he thought nobody was watching. That's more powerful than any lecture you could have given him. Dana, the restaurant manager, had been standing frozen near the bar, watching this entire scene unfold. She was a good manager, someone who cared about the staff and the customers. But she'd also just witnessed one of her employees commit the most basic violation of hospitality imaginable. Michael caught her eye and nodded toward Margaret's table. Dana understood immediately. She approached Margaret with a pitcher of ice water and a menu, her face flushed with embarrassment and genuine remorse. Mrs. Washington, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I am so deeply sorry for how you've been treated in our establishment today. This is not who we are, and it's not what we stand for. Please, let me personally take care of you for the rest of your visit. Margaret accepted the apology with the same grace she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you. As Dana filled Margaret's water glass and began describing the day's specials, Michael turned back to Todd, who was still standing there looking like his world had just collapsed around him. Which, in a way, it had. Todd, Michael said, standing up. His voice was steady, professional. Final. We need to talk. But Todd knew there was nothing left to talk about. The look on Michael's face said everything. I can explain, Todd started desperately. No, Michael said. You can't. Because there's no explanation for treating another human being the way you treated my mother today. There's no excuse for discrimination. There's no justification for making someone feel less than human because of how they look or how much money you think they have. Michael looked around the restaurant, at all the faces watching this moment unfold. Everyone here saw what happened. Everyone here knows exactly what kind of person you showed yourself to be today. And I won't have that person representing my restaurant. Todd's shoulders sagged. He untied his apron with shaking hands and set it on the nearest table. I'm sorry, he whispered. But the words felt empty, too little and far too late. I know you are, Michael said. But sorry doesn't undo the last 30 minutes. Sorry doesn't take back the disrespect. Sorry doesn't heal the hurt. Todd walked toward the door, his footsteps the only sound in the entire restaurant. Every eye followed him until the door closed behind him with a soft click. And then something amazing happened. The restaurant didn't just return to normal. It transformed. The staff moved with new purpose, new awareness. Every customer was greeted with extra warmth. Every table was served with extra care. It was as if Todd's dismissal had sent a message through the entire establishment. This is how we treat people. This is who we are. The young couple at the table next to Margaret's called their waiter over. We saw what happened, the woman said. We just wanted you to know that what Mr. Anderson did was incredible. This is how all restaurants should be run. The businessman who'd been shaking his head earlier stopped by Margaret's table on his way out. He said, tipping his head respectfully. Thank you for handling that situation with such dignity. You showed all of us what grace looks like. A family with teenage children used the moment as a teaching opportunity, talking quietly about respect and prejudice and standing up for what's right. As Margaret finished her meal, a delicious salmon that Dana had prepared with extra care, Michael sat with her, still processing what had happened. I keep thinking I should have done something sooner, he said. Margaret set down her fork and looked at her son with those wise eyes. Michael, let me tell you something. I've lived through times when nobody would have spoken up at all. When behavior like Todd's was just accepted as normal. But today a room full of people witnessed injustice and saw it corrected immediately. She gestured around the restaurant. Look at these people. Look at your staff. They're not going to forget what they saw today. They're going to carry this moment with them. And the next time they see someone being treated unfairly, they're going to remember that it's possible to speak up. That it's necessary to speak up. Michael nodded slowly. You always did see the bigger picture, Mom. That's what mothers do, baby. We see the lessons in every moment, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret prepared to leave. She'd finished her meal, every bite, and complimented Dana on both the food and the service. She'd thanked the staff who'd gone out of their way to make her feel welcome after Todd's behavior. Michael walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped out into the crisp Chicago afternoon. I'm proud of you, she said, turning to look at her son one last time. Not because you're successful, not because you own this beautiful restaurant. I'm proud of you because when it mattered most, you stood up for what was right. You stood up for dignity. For respect. For love. She kissed his cheek. That's who I raised you to be. And that's who you are. As Margaret walked away, Michael stood in the doorway of his restaurant, watching her go. Inside, the evening shift was arriving, and Dana was already briefing them on what had happened, making sure they understood not just what had occurred, but why it mattered. Friends, let me ask you something as we come to the end of this story. How many times have you seen someone being treated unfairly and said nothing? How many times have you witnessed disrespect and looked the other way? How many times have you told yourself it wasn't your business, it wasn't your problem, it wasn't your fight? Margaret Washington sat in that restaurant for 30 minutes being ignored and disrespected. But she never lost her dignity. She never became bitter. She never stopped treating others with kindness and respect, even when she wasn't receiving it herself. That takes a special kind of strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are regardless of how others choose to see you. And Michael, he could have handled this quietly, behind closed doors, where no one would have seen. But he chose to make it public. He chose to let everyone witness both the injustice and the consequences. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones learned in front of others. The people in that restaurant that day didn't just witness a firing. They witnessed a stand being taken. They saw what it looks like when someone refuses to let prejudice and disrespect go unchallenged. They learned that silence in the face of discrimination is complicity. So here's my question for you. What will you do the next time you see someone being treated unfairly? Will you look away? Will you tell yourself it's not your business? Or will you find the courage to speak up? Because these moments happen every day, in restaurants and stores and schools and workplaces all around the world. Someone is being judged by their appearance, their age, their accent, their clothing. Someone is being made to feel less than human. And you have a choice. You can be Todd, letting prejudice guide your actions. You can be the other diners who noticed but weren't sure what to do. Or you can be Michael, standing up for dignity and respect even when it's uncomfortable. The choice is yours. But remember Margaret Washington. Remember her grace, her strength, her dignity in the face of disrespect. Remember that how we treat others says everything about who we are. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. Because in the end, we're all just human beings trying to make our way in this world. And we all deserve to be treated with dignity, respect, and kindness. Every single one of us. What would you have done?